This is the Hour of History podcast. Our world, anytime, any place. And now from the Hour of History studio in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Hour of History. I'm Stephen Bauman and I'm here with Keith Riley and Mathias Fueling.
What's up, guys?
And we are going to talk this week about utopias. And we have a few things on tap for today, a few topics that we're definitely going to hit. We're first going to explain sort of the meaning of Utopia and Thomas More's important book that comes out in the 16th century. We're going to talk about the Mexican Revolution and the sort of utility of utopia in change. We're going to talk about socialist thought and how planned communities sort of led to different experiments across the globe. And then we're going to talk about some follies in past utopias and things that didn't go so well, though they might have been perfectly planned. So excellent topics on tap today. Let's start with, Utopia goes all the way back to Plato. Arguably, but we'll start with Thomas More.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so go for it, Steve. Tell us about Thomas More.
Yeah, let's start with the word utopia. So, utopia itself is a play on the Greek language. It could mean utopia as in no place. No place is like this. And it could also mean EU, if it's spelled a little differently, could mean good place.
Thomas More was tricky.
And people forget, Thomas More wrote Utopia in Latin originally.
And I thought Utopia is Latin, like the term, or is it?
But it comes from the Greek root.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So it could be no place. It could be good place.
I mean, so Utopia is this little book put out by Thomas More, kind of this great English Renaissance man. And it's sort of a fictionalized blueprint for how this kingdom on this island in the middle of the ocean runs itself. And it's sort of meant to show kind of like how this community structures itself, how it breaks down. It's very similar. We just mentioned Plato to Plato's Republic, right? Where he spends a whole lot of time describing what the ideal city would look like. But the question then is, was Thomas More serious about this little book he wrote, which came out in 1516? Did he actually mean this as like a program for how we should plan? Was it a satire? Was it just sort of like a science fiction kind of thought experiment? What was going on there?
And it's interesting because Thomas More ends up being canonized by the Catholic Church because he stands up to Henry VIII. He gets beheaded. He doesn't support a split with Rome. But I think the connection between this sort of religious thought and utopia is something we should keep in mind because there is a certain utopianism that's found in a lot of religions. So like a lot of times religions are talking about these good places that may or may not exist.
But also telling you how you need to live.
To
right?
get to
how ideally should you be living your life? How should human communities be structured? Right. If we think about utopia as just a brief definition as the idea of how things should be, of how a perfect society should work, then religious thought is intimately related to this kind of utopian vision that we need to live in a certain way in order to achieve this kind of perfectness in the eyes of God in terms of religion, but in terms of a more secular thought, we need to live in this perfect way in order to achieve the maximal goodness of everybody.
Right. And that's what it's all about, is ending up in the sort of like a perfectionist type.
The good place.
The good place. And
not the bad place.
Even though it might not be an actual place. So right. Just some things, I'll present some things about Thomas More's Utopia, and maybe we can trace these through history. So he talks a lot in his Utopia about private property. Private property is not a thing in his no place. It doesn't exist because the problem with private property, according to More, is that, people are going to want bigger and better than the other people, and it's always going to be a competition.
And it creates greed, which creates conflict.
Mm-hmm. So that's one of them. That other thing, there are slaves. So he has enormously harsh rule, and the slaves are people who break the rules.
Oh, wow.
Yes. So if you decide you're not going to go on your agricultural rotation that everyone has to do, you become a slave.
For how long?
So the utopian people who violated the rules are slaves.
Forever.
There's another type of slave who comes to the island because it's better to be a slave in Utopia than it is to be a regular person in the rest of the world. There's also, the system is clearly patriarchal. So there's a family unit and the man is in charge in Thomas More's Utopia. So that might be a little different from other things we have. There's a 6-hour workday. So people have enough time for leisure and thought.
That's dope. Good.
And there's a 2-year agricultural rotation. So 2 years you get to be in the city, 2 years you go out and be a farmer.
Oh, wow. So everybody does all the labor.
Yes. And
There's
then
no specialization.
the last thing I'm going to present, and this is, it's obviously a richer book. I'm just giving you the short. But the last thing is you need special permit to travel. So because the Utopia is, planned perfectly, you can't just be going around.
Yeah,
wow.
And if this sounds slightly suspicious to later ideas, you would not be mistaken. Many, right, Thomas More's Utopia is not just seen as important for utopian thought, but is seen as kind of an important work in the history of socialism, communism, however you want to term it. But the idea, right, that you can sort of construct a planned community or society for the greater good of all, focusing on issues of labor and private property.
Yeah.
And this is coming out of a period of enormous inequality, where people...
Yeah, not relevant. It's like there's kings, man. It's like, I am given by God to rule you. Give me your money.
Right, yeah, and so 16th century England...
Henry VIII's like, I want to, divorce and, have a bunch of wives. If you don't want to do that, well, Thomas More, I'm going to kill you.
and Henry VIII's doing this while people are starving in the streets.
Mm-hmm.
So Thomas More sees this, and he's trying to figure out a solution. So, Keith, did any of those ring true to Utopia in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, Mathias dropped the phone.
Oh, no,
okay.
we're good. We're good.
We're good. Okay. I mean, it does ring true. I mean, I recently read that book, The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. Have you guys heard of that book? She's interesting because she kind of plays off a lot of those ideas and talks about this sort of society that's borders a utopian sort of anarchist society that borders this capitalist society, and this guy leaves. And it's all about the sort of compromises that he, the capitalist society is more wealthy, there's more amenities, but then he kind of loses the sort of egalitarian mindset and sort of his sort of relationship that he has with his fellow humans by leaving that society, right? But so obviously this guy is very sort of influential on a lot of people. I was reading a lot about the Mexican Revolution these past couple weeks, because we're doing comps right now, and the Mexican Revolution is really interesting to me because it is a lot about, right, sort of getting rid of private property, kind of pushing out people that own the land, and sort of reestablishing sort of an indigenous, right? And that's the key word there, right? Commonly held concept of the land, right? So Zapata in the Mexican state of Morelos, south of Mexico City, right? Is, really famous for kicking out these hacienda landowners, right? Who had, in the last couple decades, as sort of modernization and capital sort of extended throughout the Mexican countryside, those landowners had sort of bought up land that had been previously held in common by indigenous people for generations, right? So Zapata is really famous for kicking out those landowners, right, as you read too, Steve, and establishing these communes in the state of Morelos, right? And in the early 1900s, Zapata and his army will essentially create communes throughout the state of Morelos with sort of no leadership structure, and kind of along the lines of this sort of idea that we have of utopia, right? But the interesting thing about it is that it's not founded in sort of the Thomas More thought mode, but actually in these kind of, passed down through generations, indigenous Mexican ideas of community.
Yeah, that is interesting. And early 20th century Mexico was a super unequal place. You have large landowners. It's not quite as bad as some of the unequal societies in the world, but at the same time, so there's a lot of inequality. But that is different from More. More is saying that there has to be firm structure in place. There's still leaders of this utopia. They're just leaders. He's kind of borrowing that, this philosophical leader who's not going to abuse his power type trope. Whereas Zapata is more about, people will share because that's how they've always got on, right?
Right.
Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting... And how does that work out for Zapata?
Works for a while. I mean, the interesting thing, right, is that there are still communities in Mexico, like the sort of memory of Zapata in Mexico is a very powerful one, right? Like you had in the early 90s, right? People that sort of were indigenous peoples in Chiapas, in the southern state of Chiapas in Mexico, right? Rebel against the state and, set up their own sort of autonomous indigenous communities founded around these sort of collectivist ideas of Zapata, called the Zapatistas, right? The second coming of the Zapatistas.
Subcommandant Marcos.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
I just know him as the guy with like the ski mask and the pipe and like.
He was actually a PhD student.
Yeah. I mean, I believe.
Wild.
Yeah, I mean, I believe it. Yeah. Well, I think you have because he's obviously getting his ideas from somewhere.
Right. I mean, so I guess like I bring that up, right? Because, obviously Morelos in 2018 is not a commune. It's like a place of capital and tourism, etc. But Zapata's ideas, right, are present in much of these sort of modern indigenous struggles in Mexico.
Yeah, hopefully we can keep this idea in mind with Mexico being connected to, and you mentioned in Le Guin's book too, the capitalist world is on the outside.
Yeah.
Because Moore creates his island from a canal. It's not originally an island, so it's a lot like...
It separates itself.
Right, it's like Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Maybe Qatar is the next...
Well, I think it's like kind of the element of utopian thought is that it often arises during times of incredible inequality. You see kind of the rise of people talking about how can we better structure society when people perceive society isn't going very well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like an obvious point, but I think that's important to point out. That's why you see... these tropes, I think, of kind of utopian thinking, they always crop up during times of really great inequality and social upheaval, and they often focus on like these themes we talked about with Moore, but focus on issues of ownership, land, and labor, because those essentially structure how human societies work, right? Who gets to own what? How much can one person get to own? Who works for who, and then who has control over the land, because we all got to eat.
Right.
And that food comes from the land. And so whoever has control over the land has control over the society. And I guess that was much more important, right, when, our the economies of the world were more based on actual agricultural labor, where people actually had to grow their own food just to survive. So that land ownership became a huge deal. Where, like, are you farming on someone else's land who, like, you're basically in a kind of, like, overlord situation with?
Right.
And so I think utopian thought always focuses on these issues, and the idea being, well, why does one person have to own all the land? Why can't we all share the land? Right? These are the tropes that come up again and again and again, because people see it as this is not an efficient system to structure society. One person owning so much of the land, so much of the wealth, and having such inequality is not good for society. It's good for the people at the top, maybe. And so utopian thought, I think, is sort of inherently sort of, I guess I would say, socialistic or communistic at its core, because it's all about spreading the wealth around.
Right.
Well, it's in the case of Mexico, it's kind of interesting because the problem, that's an excellent summary by Mathias. It really, puts it into focus. But the problem is the work. So who's going to do the work if you're going to be equal? Because then everyone, want to have equal work. But in Mexico, in these like sort of indigenous societies, these were people who were working the land already.
Right.
So there was no, we're going to go to Mexico City and make these city slickers go out and do the work now. Mm-hmm. It was more of, well, we all do the work anyway, and let's just spread it out kind of thing.
And I think you see that in a lot of sort of, global South societies, right? Like one of the first things that happens during kind of leftist revolutions in these places, right, is agrarian reform, much like Mathias is saying. And, the way that you have to think about it, right, is that, like you're saying, right, that sort of the advancement of capital into these places, right, these sort of buying up of the land and turning the land into sort of a commodity, right, is displacing these older forms of land ownership, right? So, like you're saying, right, the land is already being worked upon, and right, agrarian reform, right, the kind of example of the Mexican Revolution, right, is an attempt to return to something earlier, right? So, in some ways, right, these utopian ideas also have like a tinge of nostalgia in there,
yeah,
right?
Or like almost like what would you call it? Like almost like a weird, like primitive conservatism, right? Of like, if we want to, well, like, you know what I mean? Where it's like, we want to go back to this time when there was just no ability for people to accumulate capital over another person, and we all have to work in common together on the land in order to live and work and achieve, happiness. And sort of this idea of capitalism, or trading and acquiring wealth and all of that, sort of results in destruction and terror and sort of inequality and horrible lives. And so, in a sense, like going back to kind of this, like, commune agricultural society and also in a way it sounds really kind of science fiction-y in some ways, because utopian thought has a large element with science fiction. I think it's no coincidence, right, that Ursula K. Le Guin,
that's it.
she does a lot of kind of thought experiments in her science fiction about utopian societies. But in the end, it has kind of this tinge of, can you go back to what it was like before the rise of global capitalism, or before like kings and queens?
Right. And and it seems like we end up, it like a lot of history ends up going back to this time of empire when there's these interactions. And like, certainly, like I've been talking about Calcutta on the cities, and up until 18th century, Calcutta was just a fishing village.
And which sounds crazy now, because Calcutta is one of the biggest
cities in the world. And the British set up shop there, and it is like, and Calcutta is a city that has an enormous history with sort of Marxist revolts, like trying to go back to agrarian reform. But it's like once the British have instituted this new system and incorporated Calcutta into the global system, it's not going to be a fishing village again.
Yeah, and I think with that, an element of utopianism and utopian thought, going back to Moore, is it sort of inherently has to be separated oftentimes from the rest of the world. The idea being that if it's not separated, it's going to be sort of taken over or kind of like absorbed into like the global, system, which is like basically capitalism or free markets or whatever, or, kind of empires. And so I think it's interesting that a lot of socialist thought is also sort of based on, well, how can we get our community away from the other people, right? And I think you see this a lot in kind of the development of planned communities, or kind of, kind of socialist planned communities that you saw a lot of in the 1800s all over the world, or like the hippie communes in the United States. You don't say like, hey guys, let's build like our ideal society in like the middle of Philadelphia. You say like, no, let's go out to the countryside. We want to get away from people. Or if you do try to establish something like that in a city, you do it in like a building or an area, and you kind of block yourself off from the rest of the city. So I think this kind of idea that utopian community has to be separate from, which again is also, I guess, kind of this idea, right, of there's like, we are the pure people and they are not pure.
Like we already have the answers. But part of the problem too is this sort of like natural human, once you've seen a different culture, the interaction's begun. Like, so it might have been possible for these, like, at the time of the Mexican Revolution, there's not an enormous amount of cross-cultural interaction in south of Mexico City. Up north of Mexico City, where Pancho Villa's carrying on different project, there's a lot of interactions with like Mormons, with Texas, so like, it's harder to carry out a sort of utopian society up there, I think, because there's constant like change. And one of the things about Moore is everyone wears the same color clothes.
Because you can't introduce any kind of difference, because difference is oftentimes seen as creating a hierarchy naturally. Right. Well, this is like Dr. Seuss almost, right? What was the Sneetches or whatever, who have like the stars and the shapes on their belly? I don't know. You remember this story? Oh man. So tell us. This just reminds me of this idea of like enforced uniformity, but so it's like a typical like absurd Dr. Seuss like story. So there's like this like group or of people called the Sneetches, and they like, look like weird man creatures, and they like don't have anything on, like they don't have any like markings on them. And I think one day there's like a guy comes in with this machine. He's like a traveling salesman. He's like, hey, do you want to like get like basically like a star on your body? You want to look cool? And all the Sneetches are like, yeah, but it requires money to like get the star on you. And so it starts creating this like hierarchy of like, are you a Sneetch? Who has money? Yeah, but then also then they switch it where the Sneetches who don't have anything, they start getting like another symbol on them. And then it starts creating this like conflict between like the different Sneetches that have symbols on them, until finally, Dr. Seuss sort of erases it by like everyone ends up like, there's like some catastrophe or like the machine blows up, and so everybody gets all kinds of markings and no one can tell who had what initially, and so the idea is meant to reinforce that like these markings don't mean anything. But I think that's just sort of to reinforce the idea, right, that, you know, again, right, enforcing uniformity on people, because the idea is once you start producing difference in societies, even if it's just as simple as what people wear, you automatically start creating hierarchies.
Right. And once again, proving that you can learn everything you need to know from primary school.
From Dr. Seuss.
Kindergarten, the most important.
He was right on all the big issues, man.
No, of course. And so...
He was anti-Nazi during World War II. He wrote lots of really cool, like, anti-Nazi political cartoons.
Except pro-Japanese internment.
Oh, dang. Okay.
But, you know.
But anyway, no, but what's interesting, too, is you look...
Sorry, no, I'm pro-green eggs and ham.
We don't necessarily need to look to utopian societies to see this sort of like worked out in small. Like one of the things of like uniforms in school, uniforms is like the most basic form of like, okay, we're going to make everyone equal by having uniforms. But guess what? One kid doesn't get his uniform washed every day. One kid has like 3 shirts, so the white is always a little cleaner.
Or there's always like the little things that kids do in high school. Like, oh, look at this little thing I've got in my uniform. Right. And so it sort of ends up being like a sillier version of what kids would be doing in the first place.
Right. So the utopian dream of equality by uniform inside the school is almost crushed immediately by the way students tailor their own uniforms to set each other apart. But in Thomas More's Utopia, there's no interest. The people aren't interested in making their brown less
Well,
brown.
I think that's also this intimate connection between utopian thought and then our ideas of dystopia, right?
What is dystopia?
Well, it's like where the utopia goes wrong, right? It might have been a society or situation where rather than sort of the best society, it's like the worst society. I think like Mad Max is like a great example of like a dystopia. Like, oh, this is like the worst possible future. Right. You know, we're just like killing each other in the desert for oil and water, right? Like,
Wait. This is a fiction? It sounds like a
it's more like, you know, I have a club and you have like a gun with 1 bullet type situation. But basically, in miniature.
It sounds more or less like how we live day to day.
Yeah. And so I think dystopia is kind of intimately bound up with utopia because it's like the flip side of the same coin of if you're trying to plan an ideal society, you obviously then have to have a vision of how bad society could be. Mm-hmm. But more than that, you know, what are the unintended consequences of utopia, right? Can your creation of a better society actually end up making society worse off?
Well, let's take those two things in stride. First, the planning. What about the planning? Zapata, there's not a lot of planning because he's looking back.
I think there is. I'm probably short shrifting Zapata. No, it's planned, and I think
to what extent?
To what extent? I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know the ins and outs of Zapata.
Well, he's already like taking a plan that exists.
Right. Yeah.
But like what we were saying earlier is he's looking back to sort of a blueprint, right?
Yeah.
And whether it be expressed in like a contemporary political form or not, it existed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's like not a highly planned utopia, whereas Moore has this is going to be here, and like the cities never go over X amount of people. Yeah. This is more like a Soviet type.
Well, yeah. So I think it's sort of the deep history of kind of socialist thought or like communist thought. And I think the planning is a big element in it because I think a lot of the idea of utopia is it's also kind of like anti-historical vision. Like utopia, I think, is usually seen as once we create this perfect society, things aren't going to change, right? And if you equate history with change, then history sort of ends once you achieve this utopia. Because it's going to achieve a kind of homeostasis if you have it perfectly planned. Like, you know, how many people are doing everything. Everything's going to work like clockwork. You know, it'll be kind of a self-perpetuating machine.
Yeah. Right.
Once you have all the factors in place and nothing's ever going to change, nothing's going to fluctuate, it will be sort of perfect and equal and orderly, right? A homeostasis of a human society. But that is inherently, as I said earlier, anti-historical because history is based on the study of change over time in humans, in societies, in cultures, empires, all of it.
It's also anti-biological.
Well, yeah, because nature changes, biology changes. You can't whole, like you can't stop.
farm the same land.
You can't stop evolution, basically, right? I mean, the essence of life is that it changes over time. And so I think there's sort of this weirdness to Utopia where it wants to have everything perfectly planned and it wants to sort of end history, but it can't ever actually do that fully.
But is that weirdness or is that just humanness?
I think it's humanness. So how I would phrase it is that, Thomas More, this idea of utopia comes out of a time of immense global upheaval, right? This is when European empires are starting to go around kind of conquering the rest of the world, creating colonial empires. They're encountering peoples they never even imagined existed, right? I think a lot of this utopian thought comes out of European contact with indigenous peoples and with other empires in Asia. And they realize, wait a second, the way we've been structuring our societies isn't the only way that all humans on the planet live. Mm-hmm. So what does that say about not just like the truth of Christianity, but what does that say about how should we continue to structure our societies? And so, right, kind of indigenous peoples become kind of this almost like anthropological trope that they can look at. And so you see this a lot going into the Enlightenment of European Enlightenment thinkers looking at indigenous societies to try and to inform, right? So like Rousseau, people like that, kind of this idea of the noble savage, kind of this idea of like, the nobility of primitive societies. Mm-hmm. And I think though that, the essence of trying to plan things is really at the core of utopia, but you can't ever achieve a perfect state of homeostasis, right? Because it will like get brittle and collapse over time because you can't stop history. You can't stop change.
Right, but the fact that you can't necessarily plan it, or at least it's never been done, certainly hasn't stopped people from trying.
No. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's also because there's also been changes in the world that have made human societies in various different times and places very unhappy, unequal, unjust places. And in response to that, I think people look to utopian ideas as an answer to, the kind of the terrible times that they live in. And so I think you start to see also, right, the rise of these, like the idea of a planned community, of a perfect community, particularly also in Europe and the United States in the 1800s, right, when there's huge social upheaval and change and the rise and fall of slavery. And you see this idea among lots of sort of social thinkers is, well, can we try and alleviate the problems of the modern world by going out into the countryside and building this planned community? And we can sort of try and create a model for how we would want it to be on a bigger scale, or try to say that, the modern world is kind of like damned. And so we need to just sort of get out of it and try to live in like the best possible sort of communistic society that we can.
So I want to talk about one before we get to the communist societies, because this predates communism. So in the...
this is all going on way before Marx.
Right.
And these are the people that Marx reads, who then he like forms a lot of his thought and dialogue with, is like, these Enlightenment philosophers like Mill or economists.
But I'm not
like
even
Smith.
going to go Enlightenment philosopher. I'm going utopian thought from, we did 16th century England. I'm going 17th century England now. George Fox, a shoemaker who starts the Quakers.
Oh, yeah.
And his utopian idea is there is that of God in every single person. So each person has a sort of godliness about them, or a part of God in them. Anyway, so the Quakers, by default, that's a utopian idea. So because if someone else has God in them, you're not going to kill them, you're not going to, so on. There's the equality right away. The Quakers, go through various permutations and changes. By the time they get to America in the late 18th century, a splinter group starts called the Shakers. So they're like Quakers, except they dance a little more.
They're like the special forces of Quakers.
But they're like this extremely like fun Quakers, singing and dancing. But anyway, they move out to the countryside because they're going to start their own utopian vision. The Quakers start their own noble experiment in the great state of Pennsylvania. But the Shakers go out farther, and they go out to these places in New Hampshire and New York, and they start these communities in which men and women are totally equal. They're totally segregated. They all have jobs, and they create this utopian society that lasts to today. I mean, now is the end of it, but we won't get to the end. The fact I want to push right now is that they plan this society, they go out and they set it up, and it lasts for hundreds of years. They're the first conscientious objectors during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln says Shakers don't have to serve. they have Confederates and Union soldiers coming to their communities trying to escape the war.
Well, also there's also like the Mennonites and the Amish who come out of like another kind of religious tradition who still kind of maintain a kind of quasi-utopian society of very strict rules of how you live, but as long as you follow those rules, you know, things don't really change. It's like they're like, we want to farm, we want to like live in our community with God, and we want to maintain our rules and sort of separate ourselves from what we perceive to be like an ungodly, degenerate kind of modern world.
Which threatens a lot of people because it pushes off the national identity.
Yeah, because I think Quakers don't stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, or is that
Jehovah's
Witness, right? But I think like certain religious communities, right, that idea of who do you owe your ultimate loyalty to.
Right.
But with that, I think this is a good point to point out is that we were talking earlier about the relationship between utopian thought and religious thought. And traditionally, I think a lot of this is coming out of like Christianity, insofar as we're talking about utopian thought, is the idea, right, that after you die, there will be a final judgment, you know, and the good will go to heaven and the bad will go to hell. And the idea is if you just try to live according to, you know, the Christian godly principles, you will be judged righteously and you will go to heaven. So the idea is that no matter how bad life is now, it will be better after you die as long as you follow the principles that Jesus tells you.
Right.
So the idea then becomes, I think, kind of the idea of utopianism kind of inverts that and says, well, why do I have to wait? You know, why do I have to sit around and deal with this unjust society? Why don't I try to improve the world here? Why do I have to wait to go to heaven when I die when I can try to create more, quote unquote, heavenly conditions on Earth?
And this is what a lot of the Anabaptist religions say is like, we're going to create the heavenly kingdom on Earth.
Yeah, and so I think this is not just certain religious communities like the Quakers or the Anabaptists or the Mennonites or the Shakers or any other number of kind of like hyper-Protestant sects, because I think this is also an idea coming out of the Reformation with Protestantism, because the Protestants say, why do we need any mediation between us and God? We don't need this church hierarchy. Why do we have to like follow all these like stupid like ecclesiastical rules?
Yeah.
Right. We want God now. We want heaven right now. And so I think that leads Protestants to be like, let's do it. Let's plan and live a more righteous life, and let's try to create heaven on earth. And that bleeds, I think, very quickly into more secular ideas of why do we have to live, like why do we have to take the social world as it is? Why can't we right now try to establish a more perfect society here on Earth, right? We don't have to, you know, because once you start saying that you can make heaven on Earth, you basically start saying, well, we don't even need to worry about life after death. We can make the perfect society right now here on Earth.
Right, and this is what they were trying to do in like Mexican Revolution, no?
Yeah,
it's sort of the same like strain of thought, this perfectionism, and this is like, so now we're getting into the 20th century a little bit.
Yeah, and I should say that the Mexican Revolution is the 20th century's first revolution.
The first revolution,
I would say so.
What's what, 1905?
1910.
1910. Okay.
And it's not talked about.
Yeah, it's not talked about. And the other thing is about the Mexican Revolution that I didn't say in terms of its legacy is that, as you know, right, you read the Zapata book, right? The 1917 Constitution guarantees, right, the collective ownership of the land for indigenous peoples, right? The ejidos. And that amendment of the Constitution, right, is in place until, right, the late 1980s, in which, right, President Salinas, I believe it is, overturns that legislation in an effort to kind of institute a more neoliberal reform in Mexico. And that's what actually prompts the second Zapatista uprising.
And it's also continuing into the present day for the upcoming Mexican presidential election. One of the candidates is saying he's going to go back and honor that constitution.
Yeah, that's wild. That's very cool.
And he's gaining enormous popular support. Like he's writing his name escapes me right now.
Oh, this is the Mexican
election coming up.
You think he's going to win?
Yeah. Well, he's riding a wave.
Dude, I think he's going to win.
Really? I mean, well, if I know anything about Mexican politics, it's like the party that actually comes out of the Mexican Revolution will do anything to like defend their like dictatorial rule.
Do some like assassinations.
Yeah,
it's happened.
Hire out to the cartels, that kind of thing.
Yeah, shout out to our listeners in Mexico right now.
Yeah.
And
Viva la revolution.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see if they go back to that. But
Yeah.
so it's a land-breaking document, and this happens before the Bolshevik Revolution.
Right. And actually, Zapata, I've read, was actually in communication with Lenin, right? So while we remember Zapata as sort of this provincial sort of revolutionary, right? He was actually engaged more broadly with socialists around the world.
Very interesting.
But then comes Russia, right?
Yeah, and so I'll sort of take a step back. So all these revolutions, I think, kind of, a lot of them happen in like the late 1800s, the early 20th century. And that's not an accident, because you see kind of the development of this like utopian thought in the first half of the 19th century that gets created in this idea of like creating planned communities. So you see various people like Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen in France and in Great Britain.
Who are they? Philosophers?
Well, they're like philosophers, social thinkers, right? They're kind of like this kind of quasi kind of Renaissance person,
right.
You know, like they kind of dabble in everything, but they're mainly known today for their ideas about kind of what we would call utopian socialism, of we want to create a planned society. And so they write like all these books trying to figure out how exactly do you plan this.
Yeah.
And then you have people at the same time, like a little bit earlier by a couple of decades, people like Adam Smith, right? This is the beginning of kind of the study of economics, where people getting really interested as basically capitalism explodes due to like European imperialism and colonialism. You start to see massive trading and the rise of stock exchanges and companies. And people are saying, well, how does this affect our social ideas? And people like Adam Smith are saying, well, actually the true utopia is to let the market just work itself out. Like the real utopia is not trying to plan it. The real utopia is let it do its own thing. And that will achieve the best result for all. And so all these ideas are in circulation. And then there's this guy by the name of Karl Marx, right, in Germany, and right, vastly unequal society. A lot of political turmoil. He meets this guy, Friedrich Engels, right? They become best kind of bros.
And Engels is like, Marx, you got to hear what's happening in Manchester. It's going to blow your mind.
Yeah, and so this is also when the Industrial Revolution is kicking off, and you see, again, kind of these big social issues of, thousands, if not millions of workers or like poor people, basically, who are like peasant farmers, lose their, they get moved off the land, and they move into cities. And then cities, they start working in factories because they can't make a living farming anymore because of changes in the economy. And so they're forced, if they don't want to starve to death in the countryside, to move into the city where their lives are horrible as well, but at least they can have enough money to barely feed themselves. But this results in a grotesquely, unequal society, unjust, child labor, the whole nine yards of the horrors of the Industrial Revolution. And so in response to all of these, right, Engels and Marx kind of team up to say, well, what do we do? How do we do this? And so Marx, in kind of the Marxist tradition...
Whoa. What do we do to do what?
Well,
what they want is to level the playing field.
Well, what do we do to prevent or to stop this kind of exploitation from happening and from continuing? And so the idea that they kind of latch on to, or what becomes known as kind of Marxism with a big capital M, is basically they reject kind of creating just a limited planned community out in the countryside. They say that's not going to do anything. Right. But
the Shakers are having so much fun.
I know, but they say they're looking at it on a large global scale, and they say, look, this is capitalism is everywhere, and the only way you can figure this out and stop it or to create a more just system is if you tackle the economic system globally head on. And so then they come up with the idea is that, well, you have to kind of take over the state, right? You can't try to create a community outside of, governmental control. Right? You have to take control of the state, you have to take control of the government. And then you have to institute certain policies that will then apply to everyone in society.
Which in a way is going back to what Moore has already said in his Utopia. He said that the government has structure.
Yeah, but unlike Moore, they're saying we don't want to go away somewhere and build a new government. We want to take over existing governments. And so this then leads into the idea of communist revolution, which the idea is that, well, then you need to create a revolutionary body that is prepared to overthrow or take over the government, rule the society, and implement these sort of socialist principles that will create more equality, that will take power away from large landowners or the bourgeoisie, right? People who own the means of production, right? People that own the factories, and we can try to create a more just society that way. Mm-hmm. That's sort of, I think, in my mind, the essence of Marxist kind of communist thought.
Yeah.
And so then after Marx, his writings get translated and spread all over Europe. And they get really popular in Russia because Russia is arguably one of the most unequal societies of all time in the late 1800s. It was, you have like just a few thousand nobles who own almost all of the land. A vast majority of the population, tens of millions, is just like poor peasant, illiterate farmers, right? It's incredibly unequal and it's not developing at all. And so no one really has a good answer. The empire's trying to institute reforms. And in response to all of this, you start to see the increase of like radicalism.
I gotta stop you right there.
With Marxism.
Nobody has a good answer. You're forgetting Tolstoy, my friend. Tolstoy does have an answer. Yeah. And Tolstoy has an answer that is a religious answer, and it's taken up not only by Tolstoy, but it's taken up by an important man in India named Gandhi. Yeah. So Tolstoy has an enormous influence in creating a utopian society that's not too different from the Shaker's idea. Tolstoy has this idea that you go out to the farms and this sort of like God's peasant is like the ideal form.
It's the God building movement.
It is, exactly. And so Tolstoy writes enormously, and he writes about this before the sort of Soviet revolution, and he's creating his own utopia. In fact, when Gandhi's in South Africa in his first job as a lawyer, he gets enough money and he goes outside Johannesburg and he starts Tolstoy Farm, a utopian farm. So Gandhi, Tolstoy are experimenting with utopias of their own that are maybe more akin to a Thomas More utopia than a socialist utopia.
Yeah, it's so in like the latter half of the 19th century in the Russian Empire, there's just like a gazillion different brands of what we might think of as socialist thinking, religious socialism, like the Tolstoy movement of we need to go back to the land and kind of create these, religious societies that will like structure the peasants and bring them close to God.
And the Shakers are still going on.
And so then you have lots of religious movements. And so I guess I would say the Marxian kind of communist revolutionary movement is the most kind of like hard-edged of all of these different groups because they're the ones who are willing to engage in violence. They're saying you can't do this peacefully. You can't go outside of the government and do it. You can't reform your way to a better society, right? They say you have to actually create a real violent revolution and you got to get rid of these people somehow. And so that's where Lenin, you're right, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who then later, changes his name to Lenin, it's like his nom de guerre. He's born in this milieu in like the 1880s, and he comes from kind of a radicalized family. Like one of his brothers, his elder brother, is actually imprisoned and executed for planning an assassination of one of the czars. And so Lenin comes out of this milieu that, we have to do this violent social revolution along Marxian principles in order to create a better society. And so that becomes important because then he later goes into exile. And then while he's in exile in Western Europe, he starts like, forming all these like friendships and alliances and bonds with people, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And that leads to the creation of the Bolshevik Party. And then the Russian revolutionaries who in 1917 will take advantage of the war.
Right. But we're getting so far afield here. Like, to me, Keith broke down the Mexican Revolution, and that makes sense. Like, okay, you have these, like, farmers out in Mexico who have shared the community for a very long time. They have indigenous roots. Yeah. Now we're suddenly in Western Europe, and they're like, let's take these uneducated Russian peasants, and, there's not a tradition of communitarian farming in Russia.
There totally is. There totally
have been serfs, right?
Well, they've been serfs for a long time, but this is, like, getting really in the weeds. But, yeah, under serfdom, which was abolished in 1861 in Russia, but under serfdom, serfs basically had their own kind of autonomous communities. It was called the mir in Russian, and it was sort of like kind of a communal farming thing. Like they would like internally police themselves. Yeah. It was all under the condition that they have to pay like what they owe to the noble landowner. So like they don't own their land. And the landowner, right, has certain kind of like, he doesn't own them, but he has a certain claim on the production of like their labor. So
he also has to protect them.
Yeah, sort of. But he can like sell them in a weird way. It's like serfdom's very weird because it just gets really weird legally about the condition of, what laws work and what don't. But so, there is a kind of autonomy, but it's all under kind of, the ultimate control of the landowner who says, you owe me X amount of whatever you grow, or you owe me X amount of like labor days per year. And if you don't do that, I have a right to like punish you as I see fit.
So is Lenin trying to reform that system? Or
I think like, I think correct me if I'm wrong, Mathias, but like the left SRs, right, the left socialist revolutionaries, their sort of ideal form of governance, the one that they sort of held in, high esteem was that system you're describing, right? The mirror.
Yeah, so there's other kind of branches in like Russian kind of socialist revolutionary thought of what do you do once you get rid of the Tsar? Like all of them are adamant that you have to get rid of the Tsar and the royal family and the nobility, but like what do you do after that?
Right.
And so there's one group called the left socialist revolutionaries who basically have the kind of going back to the land ideology of to create a better society, we need to just go back to instituting autonomous peasant communities. We don't need to centralize control. We just need to give the peasants their own land and let them regulate themselves, and that'll be better for the Russian people.
Right.
Whereas Lenin and sort of his sort of groupies, the Bolsheviks, right?
Yeah.
They're different where they say, no, we need a strong centralized government and state that can actually, really flex its muscles to make reforms and to get things done. Otherwise, Russia's going to get trampled by foreign powers.
Right.
And so there's a lot of internal debate. But I think a lot of it is saying that we need to do something about improving the conditions of these Russian peasants and, land ownership. That's like at the heart of all of this is what are we going to do about our peasants? What are we going to do about our land? What are we going to do about the structure of the countryside?
Which is the heart of any utopian vision is trying to bring this sort of equality that doesn't exist in any place.
Exactly.
So then let's move to the follies of sort of utopianism. So we've had, we have these buildups, and like Mathias traced it very clearly, like this sort of like inequality that's in Russia, and you have leaders like Lenin trying to bring it together. Same thing with Zapata in Mexico. And with my Shakers out in New Hampshire who are still doing great. So where does the utopia go wrong for these people? Let me start with Shakers. So one of the things about Shakers is, and we haven't brought this into the discussion too much, is equality of rights. So one of the things that Shakers do that does not exist in More's utopia is Shakers say men and women are equal. Mm-hmm. And men and women are equal, so there's no patriarchal structure
officially
in a Shaker community. In fact, they can't have sex. There's no mixing of the genders.
That's why they die out.
Precisely. So there's only 2 Shakers left because they've never reproduced. So they've
Really?
Yeah, because in Utopia you don't need to reproduce these family structures because there's no more family structure. There's no structure.
Huh.
There's the men and women and they're equal and they don't mix, and the men stand on this side, the women stand on this side, and then they
never
do
have sex.
No sex. So there's only 2 left.
There's still plenty of Quakers, though.
Because the Quakers so the Shakers break off from the Quakers, and the Quakers get less and less utopian as time goes on.
Because Richard Nixon was a Quaker.
Well, yeah, he was like one of the super Protestant, almost indistinguishable from any... But anyway, so the Quakers don't really go utopian. The Shakers go too far utopian. So their folly is they promote an equality that ultimately spells the end of their sect, because you need new people. And
you need change.
They didn't plan that. So the folly of the Shaker community is, in the end, it's that they don't create a system of reproduction.
It can't continue.
Because they view that reproductive process as unequal.
Yeah, and again, I think that's like literally pointing out a lot of the problems with socialism, right, is that change, right? You have to be able to change to survive, and yet so many kind of socialist, they say communist ideals are based on once you achieve this supposedly perfect society, you don't have to do anything else. It's over. You've like done it. Mm-hmm. You've hit the kind of the end of the process, and nothing's going to change after that.
Mm-hmm. So does that? Do they ever get to a point in the Soviet Union where they say socialism has arrived?
Kind of. So the idea, though, right, with kind of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and later with Stalin, where I would say kind of where it all goes wrong is they decide that, we have the perfect plan, right? Because we are creating this perfect, kind of society. So we don't have to answer to anybody else morally, in a sense, because we know that we're right from the get-go. And as well, a lot of their ideas sound great, like, okay, great, we need to do land redistribution. We have to, get rid of like these really rich people that are exploiting the poor, blah, blah, blah. That all sounds good. But because they're not reformists, they're not trying to do this legislatively or bit by bit, and they're revolutionaries, that automatically means they're committed to violence, right? It's like, well, how are we going to get rid of these like rich nobility? Well, we're just going to round them up and shoot them, or we're going to like take all of their property and expropriate them and ban them and their families from ever having like official jobs, or we're going to make sure that we can ship them out of Russia. And so the Russian Revolution, well, it breaks down to a civil war and all that. But once, Stalin really comes to power in the latter half of the 1920s, it gets really brutal because Stalin says, look, we need to start this land reform process and we need to expedite it because we need to develop the country because, war and the rest of it. And Stalin says we need to do in 10 years in the Soviet Union what the capitalist world did in 100 in terms of changing its social relationships and land ownership. Mm-hmm. And so he says, look, we're not going to be able to do this with just the peasants, just giving them their own autonomy, because all they want to do is just be left alone and farm. But we can't do that. We're creating a grander society. We need to be creating workers and cities. We need to be creating, factories. We need grain and food for that. And we are not going to be able to produce enough food and grain for that if we just let the peasants do their thing. We need to basically round them up and put them into community farms.
Right.
If they don't want to be part of a commune, by God, we'll force them to be part of a communal farm at the point of a gun. And so that's what's called collectivization. Under Stalinism starting in the late 1920s, right? It's basically you round up farmers and you try to create these communal farms, but that's an incredibly violent process,
So that qualifies as a folly of utopia.
Yeah. And it's incredibly violent, and that also helps contribute to famines and starvation because it results in all kinds of inefficiencies in agriculture. And then, of course, if you're committed to this idea of creating a perfect society that is going to be perfect forever and it's going to sort of achieve heaven on earth, you, as I said earlier, right, you sort of think you have the superior morality. And in a way, you can kind of justify anything. So this basically makes this kind of ideology into either you're with me or against me. And if you're against me, you are my diehard enemy and you are a threat to all human happiness. And once you start thinking in that kind of dichotomy, it's very easy to justify, well, you're an enemy of the people. You're an enemy of the state, right? You're an enemy of communism, and ergo, I have to kill you.
Well, Thomas More made them slaves. But
made them slaves. So under the Soviet Union, they kind of did. They had the Gulag system, right, which is basically a system of forced labor camps, aka slavery. Or they just shoot them, right? They just kill them. And so, right, that's how I think the Soviet Union gets so brutal so quickly, because they're locked into this kind of moral dichotomy of we need to create the perfect future right now, and are justified in using any methods to get there.
All right, and Keith, you got follies for us? Yeah.
Okay, of Zapata?
Any follies. You can get out of Zapata's hair if you want.
Well, what happens with the Mexican Revolution, right? What comes out of it is the institutionalization of the PRI party, right? The party that governs Mexico for a half a century, pretty much. And they're back in power now. So the PRI comes to power. They justify their sort of power by saying that they have this popular mandate. They come out of the Mexican Revolution. They're the party that sort of establishes the constitution that guarantees the indigenous peasants the right to the land, etc. And what happens is they sort of, as a result of that, have the sort of society by the reign of the neck, right? And we see throughout Mexican history following that, various sort of guerrilla movements, indigenous movements trying to challenge the PRI, but the PRI sort of, as a result of them coming out of the revolution, right, will say that no, we are the inheritors of Zapata. We are the inheritors of these ideas. So for a lot of Mexicans, I think in the present, right, the Mexican Revolution leaves a bad taste in people's mouth because it actually leads to the founding of this kind of very repressive party.
Kind of just really quickly kind of add to that, I think the same thing happens in almost every kind of communist revolution, because they're all based on kind of this Marxian party system of you need a committed party of revolutionaries. But once they commit an actual revolution, they get in power, then the party basically becomes the new dominating force.
Right.
And again, sort of the PRI or the Communist Party in the Soviet Union or other communist parties throughout the world.
Right.
Yeah, you're right, right. It's easy, it's incredibly sad and easy to see that so many committed revolutionaries, once they come into power after overthrowing the old government, just become the new, overlords within a generation or two.
Feels like I'm reading Orwell right now.
Yeah, I think Orwell, even though it's kind of milk to schlocky to talk about how great Orwell is, he's right. Because that happens, right? If you're not careful, right, the people that get rid of the farmers, pigs become the new farmers. Yeah.
Okay. So, But in my religious examples, there's no pigs. I mean,
You don't do that?
It works out well until everyone dies.
I know, but the thing is, though,
Right.
not everyone wants to be committed to following the religious rules.
So this is a problem that the religious societies tend to have, and so the religious societies tend to go far away to places. So like, and it works particularly well in the United States where they have countryside to go to, and those who do not fit within the community end up leaving the community. So it's kind of working off an island sort of effect, and those who reject the utopia reject it. But the one way that this sort of works is it creates a utopia that is not interacting with the outside world, which is incredibly hard to do. But you look at the Mennonites in Belize, they haven't changed their ways for about 2 centuries now. I mean, they're still doing the same. Like, you could look at the Amish in Pennsylvania, but they've been able to avoid any interaction with the outside world. And I think that's the sort of number one thing that most utopias miss that is kind of necessary in order to create a utopia.
To avoid interaction with the outside world, yeah.
Because you have to be not part of this world system that is becoming increasingly difficult to do.
Right. Yeah.
So as we go forward. Anyway, so that's utopias for you.
There we go.
I don't know if it's no place or good place, but it doesn't exist.
Well, I don't know. I think there's certain elements of utopianism that are positive, because I think a lot of the big emphasis of it is hope.
Yeah.
You look at the world and you say, this seems horrible. I don't think it has to be that way. It doesn't have to stay horrible. I can hope and work towards a better society. And I think that's the good part of utopianism, or maybe kind of an element of it, is that you think this vision of a better society can motivate you to create positive change in the terrible circumstances that you're in. At the flip side, I think if you sort of are too locked into the utopian vision, it allows you to justify horrific acts because you think you're creating kind of the end of history type situation, or you're going to create the perfect community and then everything will stop. But we know that's not the case. And so it's sort of this hard balance between how do you motivate yourself to try and create a better future without basically becoming a kind of zealot who can't see outside of this vision that you created for yourself.
Absolutely.
Good.
And
good
so
summation.
So
Absolutely.
so once again, we need to find balance somehow. So thank you for joining us for this Hour of History. I hope we found a little balance here today. Hour of History podcast. We have listeners on 6 continents.
Whoa.
If you know
Antarctica.
anyone
coming at you.
in Antarctica, please give them the link, hourofhistory.com. Just as relevant for them as well.
See, this is the real revolution, the podcast economy.
There we go.
Because in the podcast economy, it's our world, anytime, any place.